And the handout will be available on our website, VtSBDC.org. We expect you to have questions, so please feel free to post those questions in the Q&A box at any time. Now I will turn things over to Vermont Law School professor and the director of the Center for Legal Innovation, Jeannette Eicks, who will kick off the program and introduce our speakers. She will also facilitate any questions. Thank you and enjoy the presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. A couple of words quickly about how this presentation works. This is an educational presentation. Nothing we speak about here is meant to be in any way legal advice. The decisions you make and the choices you make should be in consultation with your accountant and your attorney. This is meant to give you just a grounding in the information about entity selection and corporate governance as far as the law is concerned. And with us today are Nicole Killoran, my colleague and assistant professor of law at Vermont Law School, and my student, Adriney. How do you say your last name, Adriney? You think after all this time I get it right?
Chepeian.
Chepeian, who will be giving the presentation today. Adriney's worked hard at this and we're very excited to bring it to you. So without further delay, Adriney.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeannette. I'm a Juris Doctorate student at Vermont Law School. I'm accompanied here by professors Jeannette Eicks and Nicole Killoran, and we've teamed up with the Vermont SBDC today to bring you the information that we think that you would need to make knowledgeable and intelligible decisions about your business, whether you are a current business owner or planning or thinking about starting a business. This is just so that you can make informed decisions about what's best for you personally, financially, and for your business. So first thing that I want to bring up is that we are going to be talking about 7 kinds of businesses today. First is sole proprietorships, later partnerships, limited liability companies, corporations. We'll be referring to them as C Corps, benefit corporations, co-ops, and nonprofits. A few quick things I want to get out of the way before we get into the depth of the breakdown of those different kinds of entities and their benefits, their liability issues, both for legal and financial, their funding, tax requirements, and the basic background information you need to know is that you're going to see these lightning signs throughout the PowerPoint, and I want to let you know what they're for. If you see a red one, it means that we, either for that section of the entity, that portion, or for the entire formation of that type of entity, would recommend you speak to the lawyer. Speaking to a lawyer can help you with if there's some nuances, if it's complicated, or if it's really to the best of your interest that you speak to a lawyer. If you see a yellow one, it means that we are recommending you speak to an accountant. You'll specifically see these in sections for either funding or for when we're speaking about the tax breakdowns for specific entities. You'll see them towards the end of the entities that we speak to and less in the earlier half. Lastly is a DBA. A DBA, you may or may not know, is a doing business as name. This is going to be relevant for all these types of business that we talk about, and it essentially lets your state agency know through a filing that you are doing business under a different name that you filed under. So let's say I have an LLC, for example, that I've filed as Furniture LLC. However, I market and my customers know me as Adriney Furniture. I would have to file in most states a doing business as name with my, for example, my state secretary saying that although I am Warehouse LLC, I am doing business under Adriney Furniture. So they know that although there's 2 separate names, they're one of the same. First, I want to begin with a sole proprietorship. This is the default, so it's a very fair place to begin with. A sole proprietorship is any business that's owned and run by a singular one person. This could be, for example, a writer, a consultant, or an independent landscaper. So you'd have to be working as your sole person. The way to set it up is extremely simple because it's the default. Automatically, if you're doing business as one person and you're not registered with any of your state, registered with any entity, you're a sole proprietorship. So it's the default. If you haven't filed any filings with your state, you're a sole proprietorship. The funding for this is fairly simple. It's through personal investments or from personal loans from financial institutions. So if I'm a sole proprietorship, I can reach into my checking account or my savings account, and I can personally invest my company, or I can reach out to a financial institution and get a personal loan. The reason why this is a personal loan and not a business loan is really shown when you're looking at a sole proprietorship through the tax lens. For tax purposes, an owner of a sole proprietorship and its business are considered one of the same. So you need to only submit taxes once. The profits and the losses from your business are directly attached to the owner, and no business tax filings are required. The only thing to remember is that sole proprietors need to file self-employment taxes. You need to pay self-employment taxes. The federal self-employment tax is, and is the same one that Vermont follows, is 15.3%. The Vermont SBDC has an incredible resource for this, and we'll be attaching these resources to the slides when we make it available after the call. The legal and financial protections of a sole proprietor are different than the others because the owners are not considered separate from the business. Owners will be personally liable for costs, financially, legally. So let's say you run into a hard time and a company gets sued. Assets of the business are the assets of the owner. So if I'm a sole proprietor and for some reason I get sued, my personal assets, such as my checkings, my savings, my car that I own, my home that are my own, can be assets that creditors attach to pay off any settlements in a lawsuit. I've included this chart here. These colors you'll see throughout our PowerPoint, and towards the end of the PowerPoint, I will include a big chart with all these colors that breaks down sole proprietor, ownership, governing, liability, funding, tax, and government requirements for each type of entity. The ownership, it has to be one person. It's governed by personal choice. You can govern it however you please. Liability is personal. Liability personally attaches to you, and it's not separate. There's no separation between the owner and the business. Funding is through personal and financial institutions, and the taxes are personal and self-employment taxes. The government requirements are low, almost none, because it is the default if you are running a business as one person. Next is partnerships. A partnership is when two or more people share ownership in a business. When two people come together, they are partners and they form a partnership. The way to set it up is through a partnership agreement, which sets the blueprint of how the partnership is going to operate. It operates almost as a sole proprietorship with the same legal protections, but when two people come together, it changes when a partnership agreement is introduced, and that partnership agreement says, this is the way we're going to run this. This is the way funding and profits and losses will be distributed. In the event of so-and-so, this is how we'll handle it. So it's a blueprint to try to avoid any form of miscommunications. It is your rule book. And the better that this is drafted, the better you'll be able to reflect to it in the future when anything comes up. Funding is through financial institutions and partners, and you could also have silent partners. So financial, you can reach into for banks to get loans, or you could have partners who could elect to be limited partners so that they can offer funding and be protected from any issues that arise from the managerial day-to-day issues that may arise from a partnership. Like a sole proprietorships, every partner splits profits through the business. So the profits and losses of the business go to the partners, and it's up to the partners to file and claim those profits and losses on their own personal tax returns. So the taxes are identical to a sole proprietorship. The legal and financial protections are similar to the sole proprietorship, that there is personal liability equally amongst all the partners. They can elect to have limited liability partnership to provide protection against this kind of relationship, but that election to be a limited partner only protects for liability, and they're treated as a partnership in all other manners. Here's the chart. Ownership is through multiple people. Governing is through a partnership agreement. That's the blueprint of how your partnership will operate. Liability is personal liability or limited if they elect for that liability protection. Funding is through banks and partners. Taxes are the same as sole proprietors. It's personal and self-employment taxes, and the government requirements for this are low. So by default, if you're doing work with a partner, you are a partnership. The way you're governed is through the partnership agreement that you and your partners form together. Next, and this is where we start seeing our lightning strikes come in, is the limited liability company. A limited liability company combines the way a partnership is taxed and the limited liability benefits of a corporation that we'll talk about later. So they come together, and the baby that they've made is this hybrid limited liability company. The way you set it up is you get a business name, a registered agent, you file articles of organization, and you have an operating agreement. This is the first part where if you're able, if it's available to you, to speak to an attorney to make sure that you're following these steps correctly and you're filling out the applicable and required forms to make sure that your company is actually a limited liability company. If it's not done properly, it could categorize you as, let's say, a sole proprietor or a partnership if you haven't created the magic required to label your company a limited liability company, and that can open you up to some liability and remove some protections from you. So if available, speak to an attorney. The funding can be through financial institutions and private investments. Taxes, you can either elect to have a personal and self-employment tax, or you can be taxed at the corporate level. When you're taxed at the corporate level, there is an election to be taxed as an S Corp. So you're an LLC, but you're taxed as a partnership. There's legal and financial protections that come with a limited liability company. Generally, it covers personal liability from all debts of the business, personal liability for the actions of other LLC members or employees, personal liability for your own actions with the LLC, and LLC liability for members' debts and financial obligations. These could be protected, but they do come with their limitations. Personal liability from all debts of the business is only a set protection when an owner hasn't made personal guarantees for any kind of financial promises, and if they haven't been negligent in the ways or fraudulently active in the conducting of their business. Personal liability for the actions of other LLC members or employees is limited to their own. So a creditor can touch the assets of a limited liability company, but only to the degree that that member who fraudulently or negligently acted towards the business, only to the limit of their ownership in the company. We see this chart again, the ownership for a limited liability can be one person or it could be more people. It's governed through articles of an organization and an operating agreement. And an operating agreement operates the same way a partnership agreement does. So it sets out, as well as you're able to, a blueprint of how the company will manage between its members and the governing and process of the relationship between the members back to the organization and the LLC. There's a limited liability, and the funding is through banks and member contributions of private investments. Taxes is a personal and self-employment tax or S-Corp pass-through. So this S-Corp pass-through basically says that we are an LLC, we operate with the benefits and the governance of an LLC. However, we elect to be taxed as a partnership, and the same way that tax through partnership flows. So we elect to not separately file business taxes, and instead the owners will handle the taxes of profits and losses through personal taxes. The government requirements of this are medium because you do have to file with the state agency to say, hey, we're here, we're not a sole proprietorship and we're not a partnership. We are filing with the state to gain the benefits of the liability protections that come with this entity. Corporations. Corporations is an entity that's separate from its owners. You can consider it almost as its own person. And the purpose of a corporation is generally for profit. How to set it up is you have to pick a state, certificate of incorporation, have bylaws, and often shareholder agreements if you do have shareholders. Bylaws are almost identical to a partnership agreement or an agreement for an LLC. It governs the way the owners and the members of a corporation will run the business, how they'll be setting up funding, how they'll be separating profits and losses, liability. So it basically becomes the rule book of how a corporation is going to be governed, so that at a later date, if anything comes up, you can refer to that rule book. Funding is through selling stocks or getting loans, either privately or through banks. And taxes for corporations, taxes are paid in a C Corp form on profits before money is passed through shareholders, who later have to pay their own taxes on gains. So a corporation is the first time where we really see double taxation, is when the corporation, on any profits a corporation makes, has to pay taxes and then later pass those profits to shareholders, and the shareholders have to pay their own taxes again. There is an S-Corp option available for certain kinds of corporations, and we saw this earlier, where we can elect to personally, on our own tax return, claim profits and losses and avoid double taxation. The legal and financial protections of a C corporation is that it protects the owners and members from lawsuits. Because this is a separate entity entirely from its owners, and we're considering it a completely separate person, there is that default general protection from the owners and members, and there generally will be no personal liability between the members and owners. It creates this veil of protection, of general protection. There is a very specific circumstances that could pierce that veil, but that's not common. And you should definitely consult with an attorney if to learn about what could potentially pierce that veil.
And to be specific, this is civil liability, not criminal liability. Criminal liability always it attaches to the individuals who had the criminal act.
Thank you. And here's the same form that we've been going through for sole proprietorships, through partnerships, LLCs. Ownership has to be one or more person. Governing is through articles of incorporation, need to be filed. You have to have bylaws And often, if you're going to have shareholders, you have to have a shareholder agreement. There's limited liability. You can fund through selling stocks or private investments. Taxes is there's either double taxation, or you can elect to be taxed as an S corp with pass-through taxation that we see for partnerships and often for LLCs. The government requirements are medium to high. We do recommend you speak to an attorney to make sure you're setting this up properly, but for as long as you file the required forms, that's enough to, that could be enough to satisfy a corporation formation. Next is a benefit corporation. A benefit corporation is just like a C corporation, the same C corp that we just talked about, except there's a fundamental difference in the purpose of the company. So where we saw that a corporation generally was for the purpose of profits, a benefit corporation is an alternative entity form if the company wants to focus on a social good rather than profit. A corporation can be based on social good and not particularly for profit, but a benefit corporation is a much better structure.
That matters.
Structure that's better suited to suit that purpose. The way to set it up is through C Corp filings. So the same filings that we saw for a general corporation, plus there has to be annual benefit reports. Because the purpose of the company is for a social good, there have to be annual filings and reports saying that we are still operating under these social good and under the social good focused reason. The funding is a more structured way for impact investing. Impact investing is when the investments for a company or through the company are for a specific purpose that's not financial. So let's say let's say the purpose of this benefit corporation is to increase environmental protections. It's for an environmental purpose. We can do impact investing where the investments are directly impacting that environmental protective purpose. The taxes are same as a C Corp, and the same way a C Corp and an LLC have the opportunity for S Corp taxing elections, a benefit corporation has that as well. There's a good liability protections allowing a CEO or other persons in charge to make decisions that focus on a social good, where in other corporations or other businesses, there might be some issues with a CEO or a person in charge making decisions that are not for the best interest in the profits of shareholders and owners. Here, you would definitely have protection from that because the entire purpose of a benefit corporation says, we're not here for profit. Our focus and our purpose is mainly to impact a social good. Ownership has to be one or more person. There must be a benefit corporation agreement, and a B Corp certification is possible. A B Corp certification is through a private certification process that says we follow these social good and footprint requirements and are eligible for the sticker. This is done through a private company, and a resource for this private sticker will be provided at the end of this webinar when you get a copy of this webinar and availability for it. The liability is limited. Funding is through selling stocks and impact investing. Again, corporations are able to do impact investing. This is just a better tunnel and avenue to do that kind of investing. The taxes are corporate taxes, either double taxation, or you can get S Corp pass-through taxation. Government requirements of this are high because the purpose of this is a benefit. It's a social good. The government wants to make sure that if you say you're operating for a social good and you're benefiting from the benefits that come with a benefit corporation, that you're following the requirements and you're actually standing up to your purpose and your focus and your word. Co-ops are by far operated the most differently than the other entities that we've talked about. So it's member owned and it's member controlled, and it operates for the benefit of the members. So the purpose of it is not a financial gain, rather it's for the benefit of its members. It's set up by bylaws, articles of incorporation, articles of amendment, or restated articles of incorporation. Setting up a co-op, it's recommended, preferred, I would almost say hopefully required that you talk to an attorney to set it up, because there's a lot of complicated nuances in setting up a co-op or a cooperative. Funding is through membership contributions, and there are special and complicated rules that govern co-op taxing. So we highly recommend you speak to an accountant if you're considering setting up a co-op. There's member liability is limited to their investments. So liability of a member, if I buy into a co-op, my liability is limited to the amount of my investment that I invested to join the co-op. Co-op has to be multiple people. It cannot be a sole person. It's governed by the bylaws, and there's limited liability, and it's limited to the investment of each individual member. Funding is through member contributions, and the taxes are very nuanced and specific to co-op rules, which is why we highly recommend you talk to an accountant who is aware of these nuances and requirements. The government requirements of these is high. Lastly, we have a nonprofit. A nonprofit is for the purpose other than generating profits. The purpose of a nonprofit cannot be profit. It has to be for a greater good. And no part of the organization's income is distributed to its members, officers, or directors. Speak to an attorney if you're interested or in the process of setting up a nonprofit, because you have to incorporate, set up a 501c3 status, bylaws, and follow ongoing compliance. Funding is through donations and grants, and nonprofits are tax exempt. These exemptions will follow specifically a proper setup of a 501c3 and continuing compliance with the requirements. Generally, the members of a nonprofit board are protected against personal liability because the incorporated entity is responsible for the debts, not the nonprofit board members. Generally, any judgments against the nonprofit are paid by the organization and not by the individual directors or board members of the nonprofit. Nonprofit has to be one or more people. There's nonprofit bylaws that govern it. Liability is limited specifically to the members. Funding is through donations and grants. They are tax exempt, and the government requirements are high because of specifically or mainly because of the tax exempt status, because there is an exemption and there's so many benefits that come with a nonprofit. There's ongoing compliance to show that you are still complying with the requirements of a nonprofit. Wrapping it all together, we have this this chart. Going down the columns, there's ownership, liability, governing, funding, taxes, and level of government requirements. And parallel is the business forms that we spoke about. So it'll directly break down each one's, their benefits, their cons, their pros, their liability protections, ownership structures. And I've set this up to make a very clear picture on the differences, similarities on companies, their formation, and the way to govern, to kind of make a clear-cut picture of what could best suit you and your company. That concludes the entities that I'm going to speak about today, and we are now open to questions about any of the following.
Thank you. Nicely done, and we're open to questions. Anybody has any questions for us?
We'll stop the recording.